The first werewolf fact is, what is a werewolf? Now that is a question, but it's going to be answered with a fact. The answer is both simple and complicated. The simple answer is a werewolf is any person who can turn into a wolf or a wolfman hybrid, willingly or unwillingly, in a true physical, as in not illusionary, transformation. That's really all the requirements you have to meet. There are a lot more details, of course, like in modern concepts is going to probably end up with associations of silver and the full moon and all these other things that come from various sources, which I'll also be covering in the future. But overall, that's all that needs to be met. So obviously there are lots of ways to become a werewolf. I'm going to be doing a fact on that too. There's already a text one on my Tumblr if you're curious. But generally it's considered an innate ability, as in you were born with it, you're cursed with it, it's a blessing, it was from a ritual. A lot of modern works call it some kind of disease or infection, which is often in itself technically a kind of curse. But it's noteworthy, by the way, that lycanthropy was not a disease in folklore. That's something I'm going to be covering in a lot of detail in the future. So, and of course there are some other ways. In folklore, it can often happen via an artifact, like a cloak, a belt, or ring. And in pop culture, we have the whole disease thing. In pop culture sci-fi werewolves, we have experiments or aliens, for instance, Man-Wolf in the Spider-Man comics. He gets turned into a werewolf by a moonstone artifact that is literally from the moon. And then, of course, also in Marvel, we get Capwolf of the various Marvel werewolf storylines, and that was totally worth it, which I'm not being ironic when I say that, because I absolutely love the original Steve Rogers Capwolf comics. I think they are amazing. I know that they're widely hated, but they're very good werewolf stories. Anyway, I might actually also do a review of that later. So, back to the question, what is a werewolf, and how do you define one? I already gave my definition. A lot of people will vary that. Is there a particular appearance that they have to meet? No. Werewolves can be anything from a person that turns into a wolf of various sizes, usually the size of a big wolf or a giant wolf. It can be a person that turns into a humanoid wolf, basically a wolf walking upright with any degree of humanoid torso and hands, or more paw-like hands, it varies. It can be someone who just turns into a wolf man, basically a human with claws and fangs and probably a slightly wolfish face and some very serious sideburns. All of those can be werewolves. To me, what's more important is how they turned into this thing. So, it doesn't matter if they can control themselves or if they can't. In modern fiction, most werewolves can't, even though in a lot of folklore and mythology they could control themselves. Some of them could even talk, more on that later. The lack of control or the ability to control themselves doesn't make them any more or less a werewolf, though. So if you have a wolf shifter from a lot of modern paranormal stories, they're probably still technically a werewolf, whether they want to call them that or not. A lot of things today avoid the word werewolf because of a stigma that surrounds it, and that it'll probably result in negative book reviews, which is really sad, but that is often the case today. So anyway, another crucial element to me to werewolves is that they retain most all, or at least a little bit, of their intellect, meaning that they aren't just really, really stupid, blithering morons that are going to chase a bone on a stick off a cliff and get themselves killed. That kind of stuff just really makes my blood boil, because that's not what werewolves are about. Part of being a werewolf is that you're still smart when you turn into a werewolf. Even if you're one of these crazy feral werewolves, those should retain a level of intelligence to make them scarier than the average monster or the average predator. Otherwise, they're not really all that scary, which of course is a very common problem with pop culture werewolves today. They're usually not very scary. They'll run into walls repeatedly until they kill themselves, like in some of the underworld media out there. Anyway, so I personally would use human or at least near human intelligence to be another sign that it's a werewolf instead of some other creature or a witch or sorcerer or some other variation of a person that can turn into a wolf or wolf-man hybrid. Think of it like, if nothing else, make them as intelligent as the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. They can open doors, You know, they're not stupid. They can set up traps. They won't just run out there and get themselves killed for no reason other than, I guess, they're supposed to be really angry. So anyway, another question that I get a lot is, can werewolves include non-humans? So, for example, just off the top of my head, is Sonic Unleashed a werewolf? That's one I get a lot. The answer is actually yes, although in my opinion they can't be called werewolves anymore by the etymological definition, because at that point they're no longer a werewolf, because were means man. And that's super important in my opinion to remember that were means man, because a lot of people throw it around today as meaning werewolf, when in fact it means man, and so you get these really weird words that people come up with, like for instance, Sonic is called a werehog. And that would mean that he is a man turning into a hog, or a hog man. But he's already a hedgehog, which basically he already is a hog man. He's a humanoid hedgehog. So he has nothing to do with humans, except that he's humanoid and anthropomorphic, both of which come back to being human and having human characteristics, namely hands and walking upright. So even if he turns under the moonlight in the Night of the Werehog short, which yes, I've watched, that doesn't make him a werewolf, because he's more like a wolf hog, basically. He has nothing to do with humans. And he actually looks even more werewolfish than a lot of Hollywood werewolves. He has more wolfish qualities. But anyway, I find non-human werewolves outside of a cartoony situation, like cartoon characters, like Sonic, even though, like I said, I wouldn't call them werewolves. I find them really strange. And they rate really high on my WTF scale, because it's like, okay, so we have a lizard man, we have an Argonian from Elder Scrolls, or a Khajiit from Elder Scrolls, and suddenly they're turning into a werewolf? Well, he's already a lizard person. What's up with that? That's really weird. He's already an animal person. Like, you have a cat man who's turning into a wolf man. Oh god, the jokes are going to be terrible. I can't deal with that very well. I like werewolves being actual humans turning into wolves, because were means man. That's all what it comes back to. And of course, when I say were means man, it means man as in humankind. That was also something I had to address in front of a committee once. So anyway. So, is there anyone, obviously, another big question, is there anyone who can turn into a wolf or a wolf hybrid who isn't a werewolf? The answer is yes. So what is the big difference here? Werewolves, in my opinion, and this is something I think that really needs to be changed, because a lot of academia today will tell you that people like Peter Stubb and all these other sorcerers and people that were put on trial for sorcery and witchcraft are werewolves. And I think that is wrong. And I think that's painted a lot of our modern concept of lycanthropy that has thrown werewolves into these deep dark pits over in the corners, and no one wants to read them or watch them or see them anymore, because they're just these crazy feral gore monsters with absolutely no depth and reason behind their existence. They're just cheap B-movie monsters. And so a lot of people today, when they hear the word werewolf, they go, haha, yeah, a dog joke, or, well, I'm sure you're just going to be talking about gore or something now. I'm not really into horror, or I'm not really into paranormal romance or something. People today need to be reminded of all of the depth and variety that werewolves can provide. And a lot of that was taken away from them by scholars lumping them in with sorcerers. So, in my opinion, werewolves do not include the sorcerers that are turning into a wolf through illusionary magic that's temporarily granted by an outside source. So what does that mean? That means, in folklore, like I said, Peter Stubb, he was a really big one. He was a sorcerer, and he was recognized as being a sorcerer during his own time. However, he was not called a werewolf during his trial, which I'll talk about in more detail later. But he was not called a werewolf, and that's really important, because in this point in time, werewolves and witches and sorcerers and all these things, they were real, and they were a big deal to these people. So why weren't they calling him a werewolf? Because by their standards, he still wasn't a werewolf. He was a sorcerer. So werewolf scholars went back and went, oh, well, he's turning into a wolf. That means he's a werewolf. No, It doesn't. It means he's a sorcerer who happens to assume the form of a wolf instead of any other predator that he could have picked. It has no meaning. It has no depth. The fact that he turned into a wolf. It was just a predator. He could have been turning into a lion, and it would have been the same difference. Except he wouldn't have been branded as a werewolf. And then werewolves in modern culture wouldn't have been associated with so many things that were associated with Stubb. The things that he did. He committed tons of atrocities. And then those get put on werewolves by various popular culture, such as the Howling movie. So, what are some differences, some more differences between werewolves and witches and other people who just turn into wolves? Here's a big one for me. In folklore, witches do not have tails when they turn into animals. That's specified in various sources. And it's also specified in various sources that werewolves do in fact have tails. When they turn, they are supposed to have a wolf tail, like a wolf would. A lot of modern werewolves don't, because people try to give them unique designs or try to be edgy with them and make them weird and gross, things like that. But from a folkloric standpoint, it was pretty important to people in those days that a werewolf would have a tail and a witch wouldn't. It was also important in terms of other animals. If you saw a cat running around without a tail, you should probably start worrying, because that's probably a witch. Birds without tails, wolves without tails, horses without tails. It was all kinds of animals. Witches could turn into all sorts of things, which is another reason why I don't think that they should ever be counted as werewolves. And another big reason why they shouldn't is that witches do not truly become wolves. Their strength and speed and everything is often increased, but it's illusionary, and that's specified in great detail in a lot of sources. It's not considered a true transformation. They're not physically turning into this thing like a werewolf is. For witches, it's pretty easily dispelled, and it's hard to maintain. Werewolves don't have that whole thing going on. It's usually pretty hard to get a werewolf out of his werewolf form. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions in certain stories, but speaking on average, especially when they're grouped together with these witches, werewolves are the ones that are hard to turn back. Witches are turned because of some kind of illusionary sorcery, and it's easy to get them back out of it. And of course, like I mentioned, something else that's very important to me is that they don't turn into a wolf because of any special significance in relation to wolves. Werewolves were wolves for very specific reasons, often thematic, poetic. It had depth and meaning. Every single bit of folklore, the tales, the lays, everything. If a person is a werewolf, there's a reason that they're a werewolf instead of what other ever animal you might think of, a cat or something. Witches just can turn into a variety of animals, and those happen to include wolves, and therefore that shouldn't make them werewolves. It doesn't make them werewolves. And like I mentioned, to me, werewolves can come in all kinds of appearances. But to me, it doesn't include the big, ape-gated, hairless, mangy monstrosities with these long, droopy ears and short, flat muzzles and all these other weird things. Don't get me wrong, those designs can be done well, they just usually aren't. And I tend to prefer my werewolves looking like actual wolves, especially if they're put in a setting that have other animal people and shapeshifters that just get to look like their namesake animal, while werewolves have to look like these weird, horrible mutation things. And I'm looking at you, Worgen. Blizzard, really? Can they just look like wolves? I mean, look at the Saberon. They just look like cats. What about those lizard people? And they even get tails. It's so weird. Anyway, yes, I know all the Worgen lore before anyone says anything. Anyway, so point being, not all werewolves turn under the full moon. Some can control themselves, some can't. Not all of them turn into just wolves or hybrids, or have any specific level of control over when they turn, how much they turn. Not all of them are capable of spreading their curse. They don't have to be, like, basically contagious. As I mentioned, lycanthropy wasn't a disease in folklore. That's something I'll cover more. And that's basically it. The only requirement that has to be met to be a werewolf is a person that can turn into a wolf or a wolfman hybrid, willingly or unwillingly, in a true physical transformation. So not an illusion, an actual transformation. This is a person physically turning into this thing and assuming all of its characteristics, plus probably a few more because werewolves have lots of special abilities that I'll be detailing more in the future. Anyway, now you know what a werewolf is. And if you're impatient to hear more about them, I have a ever-expanding werewolf information database on my Tumblr. I update every other Wednesday, and I'm going to be updating my YouTube, hopefully alternating Wednesdays with updating werewolf facts in text on my Tumblr blog, and eventually my website itself. So, anyway, stay tuned for more, and I hope you will, as I said in my intro video, like and subscribe, which of course every YouTuber has to say at some point, right? And annoy all their viewers and go, oh god, they actually said it, why did they have to say it? Anyway, so I'll see you next time.